Okay, so the endocrine system, its main function is to send chemical messages. Okay? And so we've talked about chemical messages before. This is kind of just a general term that we use a lot of times in biology. So just to spend a few minutes trying to differentiate between when we say chemical messages in the nervous system to what we mean when we say chemical messages in the endocrine system. So chemical messages can serve two different purposes. They can be short term or short distance, so they can carry information short distances, or they can carry information long distances. And so when we say long distances, what we mean is something that will be able to go from, let's say, the brain to the tips of our toes. So be able to travel a lot further of a distance from where it was released. So chemical messages that do short distances, we usually call those neurotransmitters. So last unit, you guys discussed neurotransmitters, which are those little chemicals that are released in between neurons. That's something that's going to be very good for short distances because they only have to travel that little tiny distance, but they're not going to be very good for long distances. We use hormones to do that. And so you might say, well, how does a hormone know if it has to travel a long distance from its, let's say, the brain to the tips of your toes? How would it not get lost along the way? Well, to answer that question, hormones usually have, or there are certain cells that have specific receptors. So not every cell that it bumps into along the way is going to actually be able to recognize the message. So the message is actually going to keep spreading until it comes across a cell that is able to recognize it and receive the message. So it usually gets to where it's supposed to go. Okay. So if we talk about some of the general structures that are important in the endocrine system, there's a few that I want to highlight. Now, the good thing about what we'll go through in the next few minutes is it doesn't need to be extremely detailed for your quiz. It's going to be a very high-level, general overview. But I'll try to explain as we go along what each of these glands do and why they're important. So let's start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a structure inside of the brain, and its main function is to regulate the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is also a structure in the brain. Now, you might say, well, why does the hypothalamus have to regulate the pituitary gland? Why can't the pituitary gland regulate itself? Well, one important thing is the pituitary gland is probably the most important gland that we have that produces hormones because it produces most of the hormones that we have in our body. So it produces a lot of hormones. So we want to make sure that that pituitary gland is functioning correctly. Otherwise, there would be a lot of parts of our body that may be affected. So having one structure to just supervise the pituitary gland is probably a good idea just to make sure everything is running correctly. Pituitary gland, just as an example, releases hormones that are important for childbirth or milk production for a pregnant woman, as well as hormones that are important for regulating our water balance. So the pituitary gland actually serves a really large purpose in making sure a lot of our functions stay in balance or maintain homeostasis. And so that's something as an overarching job of the endocrine system is also to maintain homeostasis or keep everything kind of balanced. But it doesn't do it on its own. It has to partner with the central nervous system or the brain to kind of make sure they work together. So if we keep going, so this is in the brain, this is also in the brain. The next endocrine gland we'll talk about is the thyroid. The thyroid gland deals a lot with metabolism. You may hear this word metabolism a lot, or someone may say they have a overactive thyroid or underactive thyroid. Metabolism, just to simplify that, would be like how quickly or how slowly you may break down foods or how quickly or slowly your body may react to things. So if someone has an underactive thyroid, there have been studies that show it may lead to obesity because they're not able to break down food as quickly and it turns into fat instead of being able to be burned up or used. The thyroid also is going to be important for human growth hormone. And this is the hormone that is essential during puberty when we grow or when we might have our growth spurts. It's human growth hormone, sometimes called HGH, that the thyroid releases. So, and the thyroid is actually somewhere in our throat, like in our neck region. It's actually not in the brain. The next one we'll talk about is the pancreas. So the pancreas is going to be like in the abdominal cavity, so like right behind our belly button. You can think a little bit above that. But it's going to be important for the endocrine system's purpose. It's important for sugar balance or blood sugar balance. And so the pancreas is going to release insulin, which we heard about with diabetes. But insulin is important to allow cells to collect sugar And when we don't have enough sugar in our blood, the pancreas releases a different hormone called glucagon, which helps to increase our sugar levels, just to kind of tide us over until we eat again. But the pancreas is important in the endocrine system. The pancreas is also important in the digestive system too. And that's something that you'll see with a lot of these glands. They're important in the endocrine system, but they also usually are important parts of other systems as well, because all the systems have to work together. The other gland we'll talk about is the adrenal gland. So you might think of the word adrenaline. So this helps with the fight or flight response. And so that's that response if someone were to scare you. Sometimes it happens when we get really angry too, or we feel threatened. Your heart rate starts to increase. You enter into like a hypersensitive state. You're very aware, kind of very alert in that state. But adrenaline is what the adrenal glands release. These are on top of the kidneys. So these sit on top of our kidneys. They're actually not in our brain. And then the last one that we'll kind of go over are our glands that are important for both the endocrine system but also for reproduction, and that would be the ovaries and the testes. These are also important glands. The ovaries are going to be important for producing estrogen. They also produces another hormone called progesterone, but the one that will be emphasized in your quiz will be estrogen. And estrogen is important for making sure females can produce eggs every month, and also making sure that different secondary sex characteristics are maintained, like pubic hair growth, or getting the uterus ready for pregnancy, breast development, things that make a female a female. The estrogen and progesterone is the other important hormone, are going to help to make sure those structures are there. Testes create testosterone, and testosterone is going to be important for sperm development and also for secondary sex characteristics like facial hair growth or deepening of the voice, those things like that for males. So this is kind of a high-level overview of several different glands that you will need to be comfortable with, and keeping track of where they are, you may have to have a labeling diagram. So knowing that hypothalamus, pituitary are in the brain, thyroid's in the neck or the throat region, the pancreas is like in our abdominal cavity, like if you want to think of like the stomach region. Adrenal glands are on top of our kidneys on either side, and then the ovaries and testes, we know those are going to be down in the pubic region. Okay. So then the next thing we want to talk about is something called feedback inhibition. So we said that the endocrine system helps to regulate homeostasis. So let's look at an example as to how exactly that works. So if we were to look at, let's say, sugar levels. So we talked about the pancreas releasing insulin. So let's say we eat. And I'm going to try to draw like a cycle of what we mean when we say feedback inhibition. So I'll write this up here. We're going to review feedback inhibition. So as an example, we're going to look at sugar levels. So if we were to eat something, we have a large amount of sugar that now introduces itself. So even if we don't eat, let's say a candy bar, even if we were to eat a piece of steak or a bread, our body is really good with breaking it down to sugars and proteins and fats. But and most things that we eat do have sugar in it, believe it or not, even if it doesn't taste sweet. So when we eat something, our sugar level is going to increase. Okay? And then the pancreas is going to release insulin. So the pancreas releases insulin. And then what's going to happen is the cells are going to take in sugar. Because insulin is like a reminder for the cells. When insulin is released, it tells the cells, well, hey, there's sugar here. You might want to take in some sugar so you can use that for different purposes, like to make energy. So the cells don't know to pick up the sugar unless insulin is released. So when insulin released, the cells take in sugar, and so our sugar levels are going to drop. Okay? And they'll drop they'll drop gradually over time. And then eventually we get that urge again that we need to eat. And then the cycle kind of continues. So feedback inhibition, another word for that is negative feedback. In case you hear the term negative feedback, it's the same as feedback inhibition. And that just means that when we produce something, it goes back and shuts the cycle off, or it goes back and turns off the original stimulus. So as an example, when we release insulin, it goes back and tells the cells to take in sugar, which shuts off our need to go and eat. Same idea if we were thirsty. We get the urge that we're thirsty, we drink water. That water, the presence of water being around, shuts off our thirst. Or we're tired. Once we sleep and our body feels rested, it shuts off us feeling tired. So once we introduce something, whether it's sleep or water or sugar, it shuts off that initial feeling of not having it anymore. So that would be negative inhibition. If they were to ask about positive feedback, we don't have very many examples of positive feedback. The only examples we actually do have for positive feedback, believe it or not, deal with pregnancy or childbirth. So an example of positive feedback, where when you produce something, it wants you to keep producing it instead of shutting it off, would be like milk production. And when we say milk production, we mean for a woman that is pregnant or nursing. So she may be breastfeeding. So the way that cycle works is the more that she breastfeeds, so the more that she actually has her child drink her breast milk. So the more that she breastfeeds, the more milk she makes. So more milk made, which then the more she breastfeeds, the more milk she makes. So a woman, believe it or not, could lactate or produce milk for the rest of her life after she has a child if she keeps using that breast milk. Her body will still keep making it. Okay? It doesn't shut it off. Whereas usually how things would work is she would make the breast milk, it would get used up, and it would shut off. We don't have that example for this. This is why it's positive feedback. As she uses it, more she makes more, and then she uses it, and then she makes more, and it keeps going in that cycle over and over again. Okay, so then the last thing we need to review is the endocrine glands, the difference between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. So these are both structures that are inside of the endocrine system, but they're broken down into either endocrine glands or exocrine glands. The easiest way to think of this, endo, think of enter or inside. And then exo, think of exiting or leaving. So things that are endocrine glands, they produce things inside of the body that stay inside the body. So I'll just say they produce chemicals or substances that stay in the body. Okay, so an example would be, let's say the thyroid gland. It produces human growth hormone. That hormone stays inside of the body and changes things inside of the body. It doesn't leave our body and go somewhere else. Whereas an exocrine gland is a gland that produces a chemical or a substance that actually leaves the body. So you might say, well, what kind of examples do we have of things that produce something that actually leave the body? Well, we have sweat glands. Our sweat glands are considered exocrine glands. We also have oil glands. For every hair follicle that we have, whether it's hair in our pubic region, under our arms, or on our head, at the base of every single hair follicle is a little oil or sebaceous gland that releases oil. That oil is actually serves as the antibiotic. So believe it or not, our body actually produces little antibiotic kind of ointments or oils to try to protect us. But sweat glands, we produce, we take that water that's made inside of our body or extra water that we have, and we bring it to the surface, and it gets released to hopefully cool us off. So one thing to note with exocrine glands, we're generally not releasing just waste. We're releasing things to help benefit the body. So we're releasing water to maybe help cool us off, or we're releasing oil to help lubricate our hair or protect our hairy regions from infection or things like that. And the last thing, just want to review, just to tie it back in, is the endocrine system works hand in hand with a lot of other systems, but most importantly, the endocrine system works hand in hand with the nervous system. And the nervous system is the brain, the spinal cord, and all of our nerves. So the way that they would work is that our nervous system would have to sense an imbalance. So it would have to sense something not being in the correct amounts or something not being in balance. So it would have to sense an unbalance. And then it would have to decide, well, what should we do? Do we need to have the person move their arm, stand up? So then the nervous system also has to determine kind of a plan of action. Well, now that I see something is not balanced, how can I fix it? So determine an action plan is what I'll say. And And so the way the endocrine system gets looped into this is that once the nervous system decides, okay, well, I think I need a hormone released, or I need a chemical messenger released from the brain to another part of the body, then it actually recruits the endocrine system to kind of carry out that action plan. So the endocrine system is going to be important in kind of fixing the imbalance. So if we think of it like you have a car, your car's not working correctly, you may sense that there's something wrong, and your action plan may be to take it to the mechanic, but it's the mechanic's responsibility for trying to fix that particular issue. Now they do communicate back and forth. Once the issue or the imbalance is fixed, whether it's a hormone that's released or not, the brain then has to kind of go back through and say, okay, was that stimulus or was that imbalance actually fixed? If it was, then it shuts off kind of this message to the endocrine system. If it wasn't fixed, then it's going to maybe send even more messages to that endocrine system until that problem is fixed. But that's kind of how they work. So the nervous system tells the endocrine system what to do. Endocrine system hopefully fixes that issue, but then the nervous system has to make sure the issue is fixed. If not, it's going to keep this kind of loop. So that's how they work hand in hand. Generally, that's all you would need to know for your quiz. Same idea for the test when it comes down to it for the endocrine system. You don't need to know as much definitions and as many details that are in your textbook. A lot of that is saved for anatomy or AP biology.